Okay, good afternoon, everybody. If you could please take your seats and join one conversation here, including my panelists, Carlos. Okay, so thanks for coming back after lunch, and we're going to try to keep up the level of participation and interest. Once I know your food gets to your belly, you get a little tired, but we've got a great panel. So we've been talking a lot this morning about public-private partnership. So that's what the focus of this panel here. And instead of doing quick intros because everyone's got the bios, because of all the discussion we had earlier, I just want to jump right into questions. So we're just going to start off with talking about, so we didn't talk about this, we talked to some of the panelists before this, and then started to realize that, hey, everyone's doing some sort of exercise. There's all kinds of engagement across private sector, industry, et cetera, in academia. So I'd just like to go right down the road from Deborah, starting with Deborah, and then we'll go right down the road. And just tell us about your experiences with exercises, experiments, simulations, whatever you're doing. Your experiences and what you've learned, especially in terms of public-private collaboration among those exercises.
Sure. So we participated in the CISO exercise that happened a couple years ago with regard to utility and power grid. The interesting learning experience there was that they brought the technical staff in, and then they brought the CEO and governance entities in separately, and then brought them together. The biggest thing learned there was the communication expectations of the two groups were very different, obviously, resulting in some discord or disconnect, if you will, from a perspective of expectation and what the CEO and governance level folks needed from the technical layer to be able to stay in front of the news cycle, if you will. Also, remembering that from a utility perspective, there are many producers of utilities, and then there's a central broker, and then there's many distributors, and we're the consumers, right? There's a supply chain communication protocol there that's very critical. So in a sense of being able to get out in front of that and coordinate it, that was another lesson learned. Internally, from a perspective of the state, we had a variety. We're required, or we committed to exercising 8 times a year. My team, the Central Cyber Command team, exercises once a month in what's called the Information Security Community Practice venue, and twice a year with regard to a hand-selected entity or entities. So last year it was Department of Health. We had a DHS facilitated exercise with the Department of Health, where we had interjects of loss of communications in hospitals and partners and facilities. Of course, that then became the preparation, if you will, mentally for the ECMC ransomware episode that we had earlier this year, and several others that followed. And then this year we had a series of DHS coordinated Board of Elections facilitated exercises, and they went on a roadshow with the Board of Elections across the state. So we exercised quite a bit. One good piece of news, and you may be able to participate in this going forward, is that our team is building an integrated cyber command center and lab component which will host red team, blue team exercises. It'll be externally facing. The field of play will be open, and universities and any other partners who want to contribute and participate will be invited. So that's an exciting endeavor that we hope to engage more fully next year.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Carlos Vega with the Army Cyber Institute, and we participate in many exercises at the federal level as advisors, as observers, and to field scenarios. One of the new things we're doing is an exercise called Jack-Will-Take, and that's a dedicated research on critical infrastructure where we try to leverage partnerships so that we can find the dependencies within municipalities on the different IT and other infrastructure. This is a bottom-up approach. We talk to the participants and find out what they're trying to test, what they're trying to evaluate. And it stems from a brainchild with Taddeo here to my right, and one of the banks wanted to do an exercise that was going to be relevant for New York City. So back in August of 2016, we did Jack-Will-Take 1 just north of the city, where we had 135 participants from 25 organizations, both public and private. So when we talk about partnerships, that's the epitome of partnerships coming together. What came out of that? We identified the need for a fusion center. We identified that municipalities had to find a way to better improve their communications to have a more proactive defense. Related to that, July of 2017, Mayor de Blasio stood up the New York Command Center, led by Jeff Brown, the New York City CISO, who also participated in that Jack-will-take exercise. So you see these experiments that are resulting in changing how the municipalities are coordinating and operating. We just completed the next exercise, Jack-will-take, in Houston, where we worked with the city of Houston shortly after they were bombarded by natural disasters with the hurricanes. What we did is we thought they were going to want to pause this exercise, which takes up more than a year to plan. They wanted to go forward because they wanted to test the dependencies and test where their weaknesses were. And what we're finding is that their standard operating procedures are nice on paper, but when you put it into play, they have a lot of work to do. And we formed a room similar to this, with each agency responsible for their organization. And what we do is we go through the scenarios, we talk it through, and you have to pick up the phone and call somebody. It turns out it's the wrong number. It's not the right agency. The correct person is this person. So it's exercise and practice. So much so that these experiments in the recent NDAA have now become law. So Jack-will-take was now announced that it's going to be required by the DoD to continue to utilize for some of their outputs that are coming on board. And again, this started with Taddeo, and he was the head of the FBI Cyber and Special Operations Unit here, along with a major financial institution, where we felt we weren't doing enough on a regional level, where the exercises were before by sector only. So we deal with transportation, we deal with water, wastewater, energy, financial sector, energy, and to basically find out where the seams are in security and operations on a regional level.
Just like to introduce myself. My name is Mark Norberg. I'm a supervisory special agent with the United States Secret Service here in the New York field office. I am the supervisor of our New York Electronic Crimes Task Force. And this is a great question. As far as public-private collaboration and partnerships, this is the very essence of what the Electronic Crimes Task Force was designed and built for. We've established the first ECTF in the Secret Service as far back as 1992. This was something that we began to see this emerging threat from transnational actors, and we realized that we had to take a more collaborative approach. As a very small agency, our focus has always historically been on the protection of the financial service sector. So obviously from a legacy standpoint, the Secret Service was created to combat counterfeiting as early back as 1865. So obviously with the inherent use of new technologies to bolster the use of the financial service sector, we have evolved in time. So the ECTF, the foundation of the ECTF model is built on that cross-component collaboration between the public, private sector, and even academia as a trusted partner in that, from a development and looking at emerging threats, looking at emerging technologies that can then be leveraged in this space. I apologize. From a larger strategic sense, as a component of the Department of Homeland Security, I think first and foremost, we begin to recognize that this is not just an enforcement problem. We like to say we can't arrest our way out of this problem. This is a growing threat. We recognize that it does require a more holistic approach to this issue. And communication, or the open exchange of information, is critical for this. I think our focus from the Secret Service has always been working with those trusted partners in the financial service sector to understand the threat and understand in ways that we can work with them to, of course, make the victim whole, but then more importantly, to do attribution to stop the adversaries from participating in that. We work very closely with our partners at the FBI now. I think this is something that organizationally and culturally in years past maybe there were barriers, but we're breaking down those barriers of communication. So I would say from a communication standpoint, our first challenge was breaking down the barriers between federal organizations. And I think within the Department of Homeland Security, as we just saw just recently with the new release from the Secretary about the new cyber centers that we're standing up and our approach in this space. For example, we work very closely with the FS-ISAC, and we would encourage engagement with our collaborative partners with the ISACs, because for us, this becomes an area that we can share information that can then be crowdsourced very quickly, so that when we see emerging threats, we come across threat intelligence, we have a mechanism to pass that out. We have been participating in ISAC tabletop exercises. So for this year, this is something that we're working very closely with the FS-ISAC to make sure that we have regional law enforcement representation at these tabletop exercises, so that these membering partners can understand what our role in that process is. And I think, obviously, there's always an inherent distrust of government intervention. I'd like to say, certainly the outside counsel benefits from sometimes preventing that engagement, but unfortunately, I think there's this fear of reporting. There's this fear of saying, we've had a problem. And we understand that reputational risk to an organization is an important aspect of this. But as I like to remind people in the Secret Service, discretion is part of our name. So we understand this, and we always like to say, we're not in the regulatory business. We're not here to push forward some kind of regulatory action against a victim of a data breach or someone who's just experienced some catastrophic loss to their system. We recognize that to hold, to turn it around, it would be akin to blaming a rape victim who's been subject to a violent crime. So our goal, I think, by engaging in these type of collaborative forums such as this, is to spread the word where we welcome that engagement. Tabletop exercises are a great way of doing this. Within the ECTF, we hold a quarterly meeting. For example, here in the New York region, just last year, we had a tabletop exercise, so we brought our partners in. We actually went through the elements of an attack. We went through the elements of the response, and to ensure that it's not just the big players in the financial service sector who have tremendous resources, but what about the small entities, that small partner who do not have the resources, who, when they become victim to a business email compromise, that has a catastrophic effect on their business. So to your point, John, I think it's important that we continue in that collaboration, not just domestically. I think internationally, we are also, from the Secret Service perspective, reaching beyond our virtual borders to work very closely with our overseas partners. For instance, with our International Law Enforcement Academy through ILEA, we are now engaging with our foreign stakeholders to conduct cyber training and to conduct tabletop exercises in those forums for them as well, so that there's a clear understanding of what the threat is and then what the appropriate response should be, and then more importantly, how we can foster that open exchange of information.
You took some of the pressure off the attorney list, because he's talking about
Just two vocabulary
international
questions.
perspective.
What's a tabletop exercise and who is a Leo?
I'm sorry, yes.
What's a tabletop exercise and who is a
The
Leo?
tabletop exercises where we bring our partners. So for example, the FS-ISAC actually set up, in this case, this tabletop exercise was designed at a more technical level. So we actually brought in the ISAC brought in the technical folks from those participating organizations. They built a test network, and they actually then went through the protocols of what would happen in the event of a breach or in the event of different types of cyber threat type scenarios to that network, and then what their response to that network.
So you could do a tabletop right here without any
absolutely.
network, just basically have an agenda talking about it. You don't have to have the simulation, emulation, and the network to do the.
Yeah, just another one like done back.
Yeah,
Absolutely. So it gives the opportunity, for instance, your public affairs people to test and evaluate their SOPs to this type of event. For the C-suite personnel who now have to work with the different elements of the organization or reporting up. So again, at all levels, many tabletops, I think the best tabletops are really targeted to certain groups that play a role in an organization, and it really gives them the opportunity to exercise their plans Are these just plans that are on paper, or are they realistic to the type of threats that they may be facing every day? And as far as your second question, ILEA is the International Law Enforcement Academy. It's a program ran by the Department of State where we work with foreign partners in law enforcement overseas, where we then can bring training opportunities to and really foster an open exchange of information between law enforcement partners. And in many cases, recognizing that, for example, in this space, the adversaries we're looking at more often than not here, right? They're beyond, like I said, the virtual borders of the United States. So our ability to engage with foreign partners, to educate them to the type of threats that our organizations are facing every day. And in many cases, what we see is the laws are not actually even written in those countries as it being a violation. So I actually think the traditional law enforcement approach to this problem is not necessarily the solution. I think it does require a more holistic approach, tabletop exercises, education, open exchange of communication, such as forums like this. Again, in the Secret Service, we recognize that we can only look at a problem through the lenses of our own perspective. You, as partners in private organizations and academia, bring a different perspective, and we welcome that perspective because it opens more dialogue and it opens potentially how we can approach these problems in a more collaborative way.
Thank you for the
Thanks, Mark.
clarification.
Okay, Leo? And Leo, I'm sorry, Leo, you haven't read his bio. He just, in Carlos just mentioned, came from the FBI side, now he's with industry, so some folks here are kind of one side or the other, and Leo has been in the middle, so looking forward to that perspective.
Thank you. So I did have experience on the government side as an FBI agent running the cyber division here in New York, and I've been in private sector for 3 years. And so I'll give you one or two observations. One is, in the context of public-private sharing in general, the government thinks that what they are sharing is this unbelievably valuable piece of intelligence that no one else knows, and that if they share it and declassify it and spend weeks wringing their hands over the declassification process, it'll save everyone who gets it. And by the time the private sector gets it, there are 52 intelligence vendors out there that have already promulgated it globally for weeks. And the adversaries know that as well. So in general, just from a general sense, the government certainly has a different perspective on the value of the information in the public-private sharing. They also underestimate the difficulty of private enterprises in sharing with the government. Private enterprise doesn't see Secret Service, doesn't see FBI, we see government. And so handing over something that could potentially lead to liability via litigation or some other vector, a fine or some regulatory action, handing that over to a Secret Service agent is as good as handing it over to opposing counsel. And that's the light that most in-house lawyers think about when sharing with whoever. So again, when I was an agent, my job was to convince people to share with us, and we did our best to convince them that it was secure and we would be discreet about it, but at the end of the day, it's very hard to convince the public sector that that's the case. The exception to the public-private, the exception to that lack of value really is the tabletop exercise, and it's really because the government has the ability to bring people together that normally wouldn't come together. And as Deb pointed out, there's a tremendous gap between a number of layers, both vertically within enterprises and laterally across sectors, and from sector to sector there are gaps in communication, and tabletops tend to break those down and bring people together that normally wouldn't talk about the problems that they are having. So again, big picture, government overvalues its sharing. It underestimates the obstacles to receiving information, but the tabletop exercise is extraordinary because it creates the kind of interconnections within sectors and vertically within enterprises even that are necessary for proper cyber incident response, cyber preparation. So I'm astounded. I think it's great that you exercise as often as you do. As Carlos mentioned, there was not, prior to 2014, there had not been a New York City-wide cyber exercise on any level. And when we started the process of bringing people together, there was a lot of skepticism, naturally, But I think at the end of the day, the surviving sentiment was this was worth doing, not necessarily because we learned a lot, but because we now know who to call. And that was the fundamental value of the exercise.
Because you did the crossover.
Because prior to the exercise, there were some assumptions. For example, financial sector said, well, we think the government's going to do X. And the government at the same table talk exercise said, no, that's not what we do. And, oh, the city's going to do X and Y. And the city said, that's not what we do. And so people went back home with a better understanding of what was available to them, and probably more importantly, what was not available.
Except the government.
Sorry, Aquiles, go ahead.
Okay. I'm Aquiles Almansi from the World Bank, and I've been leading for the last 10 years now crisis simulation exercises for financial sector authorities. Who are those guys? The governors of central banks, members of board, ministers of finance, heads of bank supervision or non-banks institutions, heads of central bank operations, etc. And the first thing that is important to clarify is exactly what these exercises are. Some people basically do the equivalent of what is called case studies, meaning you define a problem and you leave time to your audience to think about it, and then you come back and hear what they have to say. What we do is radically different. What we do is basically asymmetric information exercises. Everything in these exercises is communications through emails, naturally in a local area network, because the kind of things that are said in those exercises you cannot afford to get published in the press. We've done something like 40 exercises around the world for many more than 40 countries, because some of these exercises have been exercises of interaction among different jurisdictions. And how it works? Well, basically we prepare a sequence of messages with the basic facts or factoids of the scenario, and then we communicate those things sequentially, creating the asymmetric information. We tell different teams that will be interacting during the exercise, pieces of the action, plus some public news. And the action starts. When we started doing this, I mentioned, I think about 10 years ago, it was in the context of the global financial crisis, so you can imagine all the scenarios were associated to the stories around the global financial crisis, the subprime mortgages, blah, blah, blah. But I like computers, and I got bored of those traditional stories quite quickly, and I started using cyber incidents as triggers of problems for these guys. And then we started seeing how they react to this, how the presidents or governors of central banks, ministers of finance around the world react to the news, bad news, or deceptively good news that we communicate. The first thing you learn is in these exercises is how people process information, how they end up thinking what they think, what they believe is happening. This is not like a case study again. We are not presenting the problem and giving the students time to resolve it. No. We are just throwing pieces of information, and the scenario is whatever these poor people end up believing it is. And anything can happen. In one case, with just one line that came to my mind the second before amending an email that we had previously redacted, of course, I just put an extra line that convinced the head of bank supervision in a poor country that I had infected the central bank system. The guy wanted to stop the simulation until the IT guys came to verify that everything was in order, in spite of the fact that everything was happening actually inside the virtual machine inside my computer, so there was no connection whatsoever with the central bank. But the guy has no clue about this. Then in some more enlightened places, We played, for example, with the difficulty that people have to figure out what's going on, creating a scenario where, for example, we start with something that looks like a ransomware attack. But then we start throwing clues that this might be actually something else. Like what? An attempted disruption of the entire financial system. There was a question earlier today about whether it could be possible to bring down the system. We did this for the first time in a country where that happened 10 years ago. I am not going to tell you which one, but it's not difficult to figure out. Well, of course, it took a while for the guys to understand that they were facing an enemy, but it was very interesting for us to observe exactly what happened. Then the second thing, as you can imagine, that happens after each one of the teams receives the piece of information that we, from the control team, share with them, is to decide who needs to know. Sharing, information sharing, precisely. One interesting thing that I did not mention, I should have already mentioned, is that the financial sector authorities were unwilling to make public. In some cases, these simulations were considered state secret, fearing repercussions in the system, etc., as long as the scenarios were traditional problems. Credit problems, like in theory was the global financial crisis, or money laundering complicated, that kind of thing, only for us. But as soon as we started focusing our exercises a couple of years ago exclusively on cyber incident response, they were willing to invite the private sector to participate. It's true that if the thing goes for real, I'm not going to tell you, right? But if it is just for fun with a scenario that World Bank invented, yeah, we have no problem, because nobody, no rational body can believe at this point that we really know what to do with these situations. We are learning. So the people are not worried to look stupid in front of the important counterparts. They are willing, thanks to the nature of this problem, to at least play simulations. In the real, they're different, but if it is for fun, no problem. Once they take those decisions, then obviously they end up understanding whatever they understand, and they agree or don't agree what they have to do about it. And then you see the consequences. In some places they do understand the problem that we are communicating. They do take the correct decisions, but as it happened 2.5 years ago in a country in Africa, then they spend the rest of the exercise fighting between the supervision and the operations department who had to implement what the board had decided. No? Then, of course, there comes the misunderstandings. In a former communist country, we had a problem with the number one bank, a clearly systemic problem. The only solution was for the government to put money. I'm sorry, taxpayers, but you know, we from the financial sector have this opinion that you are the ones that have to pay. So the governor of the central bank understood that perfectly well, and started trying to convince the Ministry of Finance. And the Ministry of Finance, eventually the governor becomes convinced that he had convinced the Minister of Finance to go ahead and put the money. So he publishes a press release, official press release of the central bank. We don't worry, depositors, big brothers put it money. Okay. Immediately, because at the control team, we are a sort of red team. We are not only just communicating the things that we have prepared in advance. We react to what they do. So I bring back my preferred investigative reporter, Lev Trotsky, who writes immediately an article, the press article, saying, "Are we going back to communism?" When the poor lady who was the Minister of Finance read that, she immediately came up with another press release saying, we have heard some rumors that the state is going to put money. That is never going to happen in this country again. So imagine the kind of things you can see. Well, those are precisely the things that you observe and obviously help people figure out what to do better the next time, or when the thing is for real.
Aquiles, sorry, okay. I was gonna cut you off, but I think you're done anyway. The next question, I'm gonna jump right to a concept of something I've been thinking of for a while, the naval escort. So you think of the physical domain in the seas, we have the navies protecting their merchant ships for the various countries. The US did it in World War II, other allies did it. We've done it recently in the Strait of Hormuz and other areas. So I thought, how would that concept work in the cyber domain? Is it a useful analogy? So how could the government, whether it be FBI, DOJ, DOD, DHS, as a whole, how could they provide some sort of a cyber escort in times of need, critical infrastructure, to protect U.S. merchants, if you will, U.S. critical infrastructure? So I'm going to start right in the middle with Mark. How could you see, is it a useful analogy, and how can you see that?
No, it's actually a great analogy, and I think within the Department of Homeland Security, one of the programs that is often overlooked, and it's something that we're trying to do a better job of communicating, is our AIS program, our Automated Indicator Sharing Program. And just recently, in fact, in our last quarterly ECTF meeting, we invited, for example, the AIS folks to come up and do a briefing at the quarterly meeting to communicate the program and how the program works. And I think you make a very interesting analogy. If you're unfamiliar with the AIS program, again, DHS is working with private sector partners to try and encourage private sector partners to share threat intelligence information. And by normalizing the open exchange of this information by using the tax and state formats, it allows us to provide near real-time type of threat intelligence information to that partner organization. And to your point, when we are able to bring kind of a whole-of-government approach to that program, it allows a gateway of information sharing to a partner organization that normally would never have access to that type of reporting. So again, the goal of the AIS program is to strip away pie, to strip away things that would be of concern from a legal standpoint, a regulatory standpoint, but to really foster the open exchange of threat intelligence information so that, again, as we see emerging threats, organizations can kind of crowdsource that information, and then more importantly, to your point, then take reactive defensive action to those emerging threats. So I think DHS needs to do a better job to communicate these type of programs.
I was just going to say, it was in the news that DHS was a little disappointed with the numbers. Only 6 organizations, which could consist of multiple sub-partner organizations, are contributing data to this, and 200 are downloading the information. So Leo, from your perspective, what are the concerns that private sector would have against contributing or even downloading the data?
We've looked at it, so we often get invitations to participate in government sharing programs, and the question is it worth it? Because each of the people we employ that engages in sharing has to be salaried and paid, and it's out of our operational budget, so it has to bring something back to the company. I don't know what naval escort means in the cyber context. It could mean a lot of different things, but I think going back to my experience, there's a fundamental misunderstanding on the part of government executives on how incident response is done in the private sector. There's a fundamental misunderstanding of how the private sector views the value of government. And so I keep hearing that if there's a crisis, the government's going to come in and help me protect my infrastructure. That's not happening. I'm not going to allow a National Guardsman, an FBI agent, or a Secret Service agent to touch anything that I own, period. What I want you to do, now that I'm on the private sector, is keep the bad guy from getting at me. I can lock my own doors. I can make sure that my systems are protected, and if I have to, I'll just turn them off until you guys figure out how to stop the bad stuff from happening. So it's no surprise to me that enterprises are reluctant to participate because the government hasn't learned how to align incentives to action on the part of private enterprise. You just don't know what makes a private enterprise do the things that they do, and that is return on investment type of thinking. How do you bring value to an enterprise? how do you make the enterprise want to participate rather than saying this would be a great idea, we don't know if it will be, but we think it will. So I'm very, I want to point you to that, and that is a misunderstanding that government executives have about what motivates private enterprise to act.
I think you just don't want Carlos in your network. So Carlos, can you talk for a second about how the ACI, their role in this, and what maybe DoD forces are doing to provide support when requested and directed?
So, at a minimum, we're all expected to provide our own security for our own operations, at our home, at our workplace, and what that minimum level is varies across industries. And in a crisis response, you'll often find and you'll read that it's a combination of many organizations that are responding, both from federal, state, local, and also the private sector. How you prepare for that, how you train for that, may determine what the outcome will be. And so what you have to do is you have to know what are the capabilities and capacities of those that you're expecting to respond. A few years back, we had a panel discussion on what the cyber red lines are that's going to initiate a response from the US CERT, from DHS, or a DoD response. That line is pretty high depending on where you're at, and then what you could expect to get might leave you wanting. So you have to find another way to respond to that. But being able to identify who you're going to call, what are they going to bring, and what capacity do they have for this. So if it's something that's happening across multiple regions across the United States, even if we leveraged everything, we still wouldn't have enough. So what is out there? We use the analogy of your cyber crisis is going to be your Super Bowl. You're going to be asked, HB Gary, ask Home Depot, Equifax, you name it.
You should use the World Cup analogy probably.
So,
well,
World Cup for
this
this
year,
international scene here, World Cup.
Yeah.
It's going to be that type of exercise. As you do these different experiments and war games and tabletop exercises, are you training for your World Cup? Or are you waiting for that to happen to find out who is going to be available, and you're treating it more like a pickup game on the playground? Whoever is there is who's going to respond. Whoever you knew to call out of the Rolodex, but you have no prior experience on how good they are and how well they're going to protect and what they're going to leverage for you. So treat your cyber response as if you're training for the World Cup, not as if it's a pickup game.
Thanks, Carlos. I got to just ask Deborah for a 1-minute comment or less, and Aquiles, and then we're going to open
You're going to limit me to a
Sorry, you had 30 minutes early, so I'm going to cut you short.
Okay, so I think I'll just pick up on what you were saying, Carlos, and say that not only is it your Super Bowl, but it's your all hands on deck. It's your Cyber Sandy. So if you're practicing in an SOP standpoint, let's practice for malware. Oh, that's just like every day. Or let's practice for business email compromise. That might be okay for your tactical teams. It might be okay for an operational discussion, but it's not okay to waste state time and dime and federal time and dime, and yes, we do invite our federal partners to the table, or private sector time and dime on an enterprise mission that's not really reflecting a cyber Sandy. So to your point, find out where your cyber sandbags are. You have resources, you have a fly team I can count on, a reciprocal agreement with New Jersey. Vermont can let us operate out of their data center, and so on. You need to get those resources lined up. You need to know what the capacity and capability is. You need to have people on speed dial. You need to keep your contacts up to date. You need to have private sector partners that you can call on, not just one, but probably multiple. For a wide span incident, you can assume that you're busy doing your thing because you got affected too, and you are as well. So how much can I expect from you if you're already engaged in the play in your own camp? So you've got to approach this as though any of those resources could be pulled. So when you practice, like Marines do, right? Practice and practice and practice and practice. Practice as though resources are going to be peeled away from you. Not just injections, right? The surprise. So now this happened. So now this information has become available. So now this resource just disappeared that you counted on. You thought you could operate in Vermont, but you can't for this reason. They're active too. you thought you could call active duty DMNA resources, but the governor doesn't want to pay for them. That wouldn't be the case in my case, but let's just say it is. So you look at it as though you're being disadvantaged, right? Your primary mandate, or whomever it is you have on speed dial, can't come because they're also contracting with 5 other entities, and guess what? You're fourth in line. From a practical intents and purposes, if you don't know what your priority is in the third-party resources that you're going to call upon, you cannot assume you're one, right? Because if 20 entities are being served by that entity that you're counting on, you might be 19 or 20 in their radar. So I think that if you look at it with all resources that you would need, and then subtract resources, pull resources off the line, that's a very, very glaring opportunity for you to see what crucial resources you just cannot do without, and then invest in those areas to double down.
Thank you. Aquiles, we talked about this on the phone a little bit, but
Right.
you mentioned IT, you prepared this index. Can you talk about that for just a second?
Yeah.
What you've seen that works internationally?
Well, two things. I wanted to underline one word that Deborah just mentioned, which I think is absolutely fantastic. When you are talking about simulations, use the idea of practicing decision making. One thing against these exercises we run is when people believe that they are taking a test that they can pass or fail. If that is the case, they will do what they think the teachers expect to see and not what they would really do. You have to convince them that they have to practice. The other thing is another key concept that I heard from Mark, the idea of the wall of government approach. This is absolutely essential because in the countries we work with, the trust in public institutions is not very high. And in particular, the trust of financial institutions in financial sector authorities is lower than average, let's say, no? Because of the incentives, which are worse than in most other activities. In places where things work, we've seen, for example, financial institutions facing a problem, calling first a CERT, a public CERT. And only when they have a clear understanding, or they believe to have a clear understanding of what's going on, then comply with their regulation that says that they have to inform the supervisor. It is absolutely fundamental to have these wall of government approaches, and I think that the issue of trust is always going to hamper the relation with the authorities. Sharing information is a problem, and money is important.
I'm going to end on that point because that's okay. I'm glad we got to the point of trust. That's what going to come out. But I don't have much time, so 2 questions. 1, 2. Yes, please. And please, the name, affiliation, and question.
Sure. My name is Sunil Madhu, the founder and CEO of Secure. We're an identity verification company. Listening to all your conversations, 2 things strikes out. It is entirely unclear for me in the private sector as to who is the owner of the emergency management system should shit hit the fan. Right? So for example, in natural disasters or something that affects our country as a whole, there's FEMA. Then FEMA has a protocol and a thing that takes control of everything, and all the agencies report into it. So FEMA is the source, the system of record for information. What is the equivalent of that in the government, amongst the government agencies for cyber attacks? And the other part of the thing that occurs to me is that this is a collective intelligence problem. So why don't we just create a law at the federal level that forces all private entities to disclose to a central authority, just like we do for data breaches, for example, when cyber attack events are detected by their own internal systems, distributed systems, that feed collective intelligence data into this one place where perhaps a machine learning system or something can look at it and say, well, hang on, these little attacks that are happening here aren't just in isolation, they're part of something larger, and maybe FEMA needs to now treat this as a national emergency. Is there that kind of protocol or ownership in
Yeah, so let me ask Mark to answer the first one, and the second one, just real quickly. I mean, I think AIS is trying to get there, but it's voluntary, so that's the problem.
Right.
And I'll let someone else.
Yeah, I think to your point, government, as we see an increase in these type of events, I think, from a government perspective, I would love this type of system,
Right.
right? To have a compelled sharing of information. To Leo's point, quite frankly, post-incident, again, we're not in the...
That's
we're not
reactive,
firemen.
right?
Yeah,
Exactly.
we're not firemen, we're not there to help ensure the integrity of your system. But at this point, I think the government does need to do a better job in creating a construct for guidance, creating a construct, and I think that is the focus of DHS at this point, is to move in that direction, to give a more centralized, whole-of-government type of approach, even if that's just best recommendations, best practices, through the NCIC. I think we see this through CERT, a concerted effort to at least open the doorway to communication, which up until this point hasn't been there. And I think some of that is incumbent upon us in the government to make sure that we're communicating what resources are available, what preventative measures could be taken, and programs like AIS, which then the goal is to give you that type of more granular type of information flow so that now you can take reactive.
If I'm not mistaken, so we have a national response plan overall.
Yeah.
I believe we have a national cybersecurity.
Yeah, absolutely, and we have those constructs in place, and I think the Colonel really brought some focus to that in the sense that what are those red lines, and I think, as the Colonel mentioned, in most cases, those red lines are very high bars. So to the small company, to the small retail type merchant, is that realistic? To him, it's the most catastrophic type of, it's a life-changing event. I'm not sure that we, from a national perspective, are engaging at that level yet, though.
And from a state level, if I might speak to that, John, it's mirroring the same thing as the Fed. So downhill from the DHS would be DHS-ES, Emergency Services. And we would have the same red line and the same high bar, if you will, insofar as when we would call on additional resources. So the rule of thumb is handle it locally. If you can handle it locally, good. If not, go upstream one by one. So if it's a town of whatever, they would ask the city of New York City, they would ask the state to help. If the state can't handle it, we would ask DHS-ES and pull out
The problem with looking at it ground up from my perspective is that the attack surface is so wide, especially when you're dealing with national actors, that they could be attacking America in what appears to be silo attacks, but is actually a consolidated group attack across our infrastructure.
So your point's well taken in terms of visibility, and as my colleagues have spoken about the AIS systems, that's the solution. Taking down the barriers, instilling trust, understanding that when they say something, that it's actionable. And you don't have to, by the way, tell us the backstory, right? So I don't even care if I know the backstory. I just need to know, if you send me a tear off, that information is actionable and act on it. I won't ask why. If I don't have the clearance to ask why, I do. But if I don't have the clearance to ask why, that's not the point. Just act on it. So get to that level.
Just last question, and brief as you can.
Yes, my question is, Kasher Chand, my question is directed more to a comment that Leo had stated earlier, as to that the government doesn't really understand what motivates private sectors to engage in those sort of tabletop exercises. But has there been any discussion on the private sector end that maybe in the event of a breach, that using evidence of your engagement in these private sector exercise could be used as evidence of you taking reasonable precautions to prevent against these threats? And to, in a litigation context, saying, look, we engaged with the government end of things, we attended these events, and this shows that we were trying to take reasonable precautions to prevent against the breach.
I suppose it could. It would depend on what, so in the case of a regulatory body coming in and saying you're being fined because you failed to adhere to a regulation, and you're saying participation in a
by using that as evidence in front of that regulatory body that, look, we were engaging in government exercises to make sure we were on top of things.
It could be. I don't have expertise in that area in terms of defending against government
Yeah, I was just wondering if there was any
seems
discussion
reasonable,
by the
but-
council's end on that side.
So,
I don't know.
I think
I
the
think-
only thing
sorry.
that would, the only thing that would remove that barrier is if government stood down the response to what we learned as a result of the information sharing. In other words, if something learned in the course of that discussion did not hurt you, was determined right up front not to be a liability from a regulatory standpoint, that anything discovered during the sharing of cyber intel cannot be used against you, I guess to paraphrase it. And that's, I think, the only thing that's going to move that needle, quite frankly.
Okay, please join me in thanking our guests.